Vice President J.D. Vance defended the indictment of former FBI Director James Comey, claiming he did lie under oath at a congressional hearing. Comey, as we know, was indicted by the U.S. Attorney in Virginia on Friday. President Trump says the DOJ may also be investigating former FBI Director Christopher Wray as well. President claiming Wray misled Congress about the FBI undercover agents in the January 6th crowd.
We're joined now by Cheryl Bader, Fordham University law professor and former federal prosecutor with the U.S. Attorney in New Jersey. So, Ms. Bader, from your experience as a federal prosecutor, how strong does a case need to be to secure an indictment for lying under oath or obstructing a congressional proceeding?
Well, so in this case, we see that several career prosecutors who were looking at the evidence here decided that it was not strong enough to bring this case. And yet those individuals were fired, and a new prosecutor who had no prosecutorial experience or any criminal law experience whatsoever was brought in at the last minute to bring this indictment. And we saw that she went into the grand jury, her first time in the grand jury. When I was in AUSA, you had a more seasoned attorney coming in with you and teaching you about the grand jury process. She went in to secure this indictment just before it would be time barred by the statute of limitations. And it does look like there is a flimsy, what we call non-speaking indictment. In other words, the indictment just says, here are the charges, but doesn't actually lay out any of the evidence against Comey.
I know over the weekend, J.D. Vance said we're going to let the law drive this, and President Trump also claiming this is about accountability, not politics. Talk about the legal issues of that. How is that, in fact, assessed, whether this is sort of revenge or whether this is about accountability?
Well, justice is supposed to be blind. Justice isn't supposed to be blindly following what the president's wishes are. And we've seen this weaponization of the justice process, which is actually quite troubling.
The grand jury seem to be as divided as the country is. Only 14 out of 23 of the grand jurors voted to indict Comey. Is that common, or does this say anything about the case?
So, grand jury processes are secretive, and there's really a relationship between the prosecution and the grand jurors. And so the grand jurors are supposed to ask questions of the prosecutor and try to assess the evidence. And so, one of the things that I think was unusual here is that there were some other charges that the grand jurors did not want to bring. And again, just how the prosecutor couldn't even figure out how to file this was done very much at the last minute. And it does seem like this is just part of Trump's vendetta tour. We don't want to have a situation where you target an individual and then you go on a fishing expedition to look for what crimes they might have committed. And I think this raises a lot of questions in terms of Comey's defense of, vindictive prosecution and selective prosecution.
And can you shed some light on us, the difference between presenting before a grand jury and getting an indictment from the panel versus what has to actually happen during a trial and the bar that's raised there in terms of getting a conviction?
Right. So the grand jury process is really a process to make sure that the prosecutor has enough evidence to bring a case forward, right? Because even the accusation is quite serious. But the trial, the prosecution has to prove every element of the crime beyond a reasonable doubt. So they would have to prove that there was a corrupt intent here. They would have to prove that the proceedings were actually disrupted, right? So it's a much higher standard than the grand jury process of just finding that there's a probable cause and cause to go forward with the case.
Up to this point, the Justice Department has historically tried to keep itself separate from politics. Does this now indicate a shift in how politicians could influence federal prosecutions, and what should the public be aware of?
Absolutely. This is very troubling because there's always been this norm and this culture that there's an independence to the prosecution. And when I was a federal prosecutor, I was a Democrat in a Republican administration, and I never felt that politics, was ever the question. We looked at the law and the facts and made decisions based on just those things, and not, who the president was or what the president wanted. And there's a real erosion of that norm. And now judges are looking much more skeptically at what prosecutors do, the motions that they're filing, the arguments that they're making. And so we're going to see much more responsibility on the judiciary, and an erosion of this concept of regularity, that we can trust that the prosecutors are not, what we think of, lawyers as like hired guns, that they are representing the public and not a private interest. And so, again, not that I'm going to glorify prosecutors. I tell my students that we have to look very critically at our criminal justice system, and there are many, many flaws. But, having it be a personal vendetta tool for politics is just going to be a much greater erosion to the system.
Professor Cheryl Bader, we thank you for being here on Connecting America. And we know on Friday the president called for other so-called corrupt radical left to be indicted as well. So we'll see if there continues to be other names that are brought before.
Yeah, he's made a list and he's checking it twice.